All right, guys, welcome back to the CodeX Cantina. We are doing a part 2 because we cannot stop talking about this book, short story, novella that we hate because it is so dang important and it is so rich and dense with subjects to talk about. If you missed the first part, it is the philosophy and the kind of the coverage of kind of comparing Kierkegaard, the father of existentialism, along with Tolstoy here. And today we are going to cover kind of the concept of economics and aristocratic economic type things. Let me kick it over to Crypto to start this conversation.
I'm Crypto. So we talked about the philosophical viewpoint of this, and I think in the story there are there are several others, and I think I want to talk about 3 today. And the first one we talk about is kind of the social aspect of the story. Where we see a lot of uniqueness in this story because I believe this is what would be considered upper middle class or even lower upper class. And I think that affords a lot of uniqueness to his life and story. And I think a mass majority of particularly Americans and many people around the world can relate to this. And I think that is something that is a still valuable lesson, that socially things are sometimes more acceptable because of your class or your economic status. And so those two are kind of intertwined together. And so my question to you, Una, is what uniqueness do you feel, or maybe you gleaned out of this because of Ivan Ilych's social/economic status?
So I think you have, in the beginning, you have some of the keeping up with the Joneses, where Ivan Ilyich is trying to live outside of his means. You see him trying to get that job. His life is his ego is crushed when he doesn't get the job that he wanted. So I think there's a lot to talk about, from the rise of the young star to the fall from grace there, when he realizes that he was living life wrong later on in the story.
Yeah. So I think that as you increase in maybe education, you increase in social status, increase in a preferred profession, depending on, again, maybe what culture or country you're living in and time frame that you're living in. I think that it affords you the ability to be comfortable with greed. And I think that that is a driving force behind a lot of people. And when he's dying at the end, he realized the mistakes of his life, and that greed is something that is maybe going to push you faster into the grave. And I think that nowadays we see another thing I think that is parallel to greed, and that's materialism. That really started like in the 1970s, 1980s with the Americanization of the globe. And I think that driving force in this story is, what does he do once he gets his second better job and gets that $5,000? What does he start doing to his home?
He starts decorating.
He starts decorating, and he gets all these little material possessions, and he's very meticulous about that. And you probably have friends, and I have friends, and the viewers out there have friends that have people that are so meticulous about their car or their boat or their man cave or their office, where they have to show their greed, their bravado of, they have the big fancy desk with the chairs, and their chair is always bigger and cushier and fancier than the person that's sitting across. And they have their awards, and they have their education plaques and their degrees on the wall, and maybe famous photos of people that they've, met, like a president or something, right? And I think that as a class and as your economic status, you think you have the right to do that more than, say, a poor person would. Or, of course, you have the ability to do that as well, but it's more socially acceptable for you, for the rich lawyer or doctor or sports star, to be able to do those things, right? Because if I do them as maybe, an okay so-so middle-class teacher, I look ridiculous.
Well, I actually saw a talk on poverty. And one of the things that he talked about is poverty isn't just money. It can also be love. People can be povern in relationships and love, and they can also be povern in economic status. And one of the things that he said is there is a social pressure that when you are in a lower economic state, that when you transcend, when you move up, when you do get that job promotion, you're going to get pressure of, oh, Johnny's too good for us now. Johnny's making the big cash, so he can go do those things. And you see Johnny stop hanging out with those people and moving up. And you'll see social pressure to almost keep people down, to keep people in your social class rather than rising up or transcending and moving up to a higher economic class as a form of like money shaming people.
Yeah, and this happens in the story as well with that same thing. So we can see a lot of parallels, and I think that's, you could go back all the way of, which caveman had more resources is going to be treated differently than those that don't. And that's just human nature. And I think that you get a lot in this story of that economic and social entwinement of how people are viewed differently and treated differently. And I know that's kind of obvious, but it is seen so, I don't know the word I'm looking for, detrimental to Ivan Ilyich's life and his story, and I think that that's a lesson that a lot of us could learn today as we focus on material possessions and we don't focus on maybe things that could be more important in our lives, like our family, or we think we're taking care of our family because we're working ourselves to death in our job to provide for them, quote, a better life, when all they really want is you to be around and give them a hug or talk with them or something. So yeah, I think that's a very good point that is something you could learn from this story.
Absolutely.
So the other thing that I think is hugely important to the story is, of course, religion. And this is something that I think Tolstoy put a lot of his personal thoughts into because he was a very deeply religious individual. And I think that it's a little bit preachy towards the end. And I don't have a problem with that. I don't have a problem with people having a personal relationship with whatever deity they want to worship. But I think the story goes to a point to say that you do need to reach a existential bliss, nirvana relationship with God, knowing you're going to have an afterlife, or that you're going to, I don't know, something's going to happen after when you die. And I don't know if I agree with that. And so that's interesting that he goes that way. What do you think?
I think it comes down, it's a belief system. I'm not saying just because you don't believe it doesn't mean you can't enjoy the story, right?
Right.
And I feel the same way that he found salvation through God. People can find salvation through various forms besides God, and it doesn't have to be that way. It just so happens that Tolstoy had a very fervent relationship once he discovered, once he went through a crash, if you will. And when people hit a low point, they need a ladder thrown to them. And many times it can be religion, where an immediate community can become available to people. It's interesting in the story that he had a community around him, but the community is what was drowning him. And God was the ladder that pulled him out of that. As long as I pursue these material things, they always say that when you die, you can't bring your money with you to the afterlife. That it's interesting that this was his way of saving himself, whether it's a deity or whether it's something else. That's the way Tolstoy viewed his salvation, if you will. Because he was born aristocratic. He wanted to give away all his money. It was a big point of contention with him and his wife at the time. And there's like an interesting way they resolved that, where he said, okay, well, I'll give my money away, but you can keep the copyright and royalty to stories published pre this time period. It's kind of interesting, but people can be dragged down by material things, and the only way to get rid of that is to just give them away, to move on with life, and you find your salvation in various ways sometimes.
Yeah, and there's a real life story of this basically happening. So Andrew Carnegie, however you say it, was the wealthiest person in the world during the early 20th century, late 19th century, and he was worth approximately $500 million back then, which is a ludicrous amount of money. And he got sick, and he was dying, and he realized that he couldn't take his mass fortune with him. And so he sold Carnegie Steel to J.P. Morgan, and he had like $500 million in the bank. And of course, that would be worth that's back then. He had that much money, so that would be worth like trillions today. And he gave most of it away. Because he realized he couldn't, he couldn't take it with him. And I don't know if he so much found God, but he found a way to reach that inner peace. And I think that's what really this comes down to, is Ivan Ilyich found inner peace. And I think he also distinguished, and this is something that always kind of makes me not mad, but I find fascinating with religion, is that so many religions always equate pain and death together, like you mentioned in our last video, where you die, and if you don't have salvation, you're going to go to a place and be tortured. And how are you going to be tortured? With physical pain, right? That's one of the always things that you're taught as a little kid. And he's being tortured by a physical pain, and he seeks salvation, but the physical pain doesn't matter anymore, especially when he has the last 3 days of pure agony, which of course is a direct correlation with the 3 days that Christ will suffer, and then the 3 days for the resurrection. So there's a lot of symbolism there as well.
And the first chapters span 40 years. And 40 years is obviously a big number in the Bible when it comes to kind of, the desert and the...
So there's all those numbers and stuff, and I didn't count them, and I was going to ask you this because I know that you like doing this stuff, and I'm sure you don't know, but I actually wrote down in my questions for Una, I put, hold on, let me find my notes, crap. I said, Una, did you count the number of times that he crosses himself in the first chapters?
No, I didn't.
Because I figured
a lot.
Yeah, because he's like, oh, he does it. I'm doing it right now, and he does it over and over and over and over again. And
it's his anchor. He's like, I feel uncomfortable. I don't know what to do. I'll cross myself.
Yeah. So the one last thing this is just kind of a silly thing, and I don't know if you picked up on it, and I may have read it wrong or interpreted it wrong, but he talks about how it's accepted because of his social status, or he's in college, or just it was boys being boys type of thing, that like old stupid mentality. But I think it's when he's in college, he talks about it's just what we did, and I think he was either referring to masturbation, or maybe that he was sleeping with the other boys in college. And did you pick up on that?
No, I did not. I missed that one.
Yeah, and I don't remember where it was. It was pretty early, I think, in chapter 3. That it's going through, it's doing the montage of his life, getting up to the point where the story slows down. And it was interesting that Tolstoy wrote about that, because I don't know what he was talking about, but it was something sexual, but it was okay because of their class. And of course, if you were a poor person, that would have been a big no-no. Or, in America, where our viewpoint at that time period was very different than it is, forward progressive way of thinking modern times. So I thought that was kind of funny as well. That does does class and wealth afford you more accoutrements?
That is a good question. Let's continue that conversation in the comments below. Let's wrap up this video. If you appreciate the conversation that we're having here, please consider subscribing and hit the like button, and we'll talk to you guys again soon.
Peace out.